A billionaire CEO got into his car and found a little girl in the passenger seat who whispered, "Everyone gets picked up, but no one comes for me." Michael Grayson never intended to linger at the school longer than necessary. His day had already been packed with investor meetings, calls with overseas partners, and overseeing 2 major construction sites. Coming to this rundown elementary school on the south side of the city was just another item on his agenda. A routine signing for a redevelopment project. He moved through the school's aging hallways with his usual sense of purpose, perfectly tailored light blue suit crisp against the backdrop of peeling paint and old posters tacked to the walls. He exchanged polite words with the principal, signed the last page of the contract, and made his way toward the parking lot with his signature briefcase in one hand and his phone in the other. His mind was already shifting back to business. But everything changed the moment he opened the door to his sleek black car. He froze. Sitting quietly in the front passenger seat was a little girl no older than 6. She had wavy brown hair that hung just below her shoulders, large chestnut eyes that held an emotion far older than her years, and a small navy blue backpack resting on her lap. She wore a yellow sweater that looked slightly too thin for the weather and a faded denim skirt. Her knees were pressed together, her fingers gently gripping the strap of her bag. For a long moment, neither of them said a word. Michael's first instinct was shock. He had no idea how she'd gotten into his car, and his hand reflexively tightened around his keys. He glanced around the parking lot, expecting to see a parent rushing up an apology or a teacher hurrying over to explain. But the lot was nearly empty now, the children who had once filled it already picked up and gone home. The girl didn't move. She simply looked at him, her eyes cautious but calm, as if she had been waiting. Then, in a voice so soft it was nearly drowned out by the hum of city traffic beyond the fence, she spoke. "Everyone gets picked up, but no one comes for me." Michael blinked, stunned by the simplicity of her words and the unbearable weight behind them. He followed her gaze toward a small group of students across the lot. A few boys were laughing, pointing in her direction, clearly amused by her presence in his car. Michael could see it now. She had been mocked, left out, and ignored. Not just today, but likely for a very long time. He opened his mouth, unsure of what he meant to say. Was he supposed to call someone, alert the school staff, ask her to step out? But something in him hesitated. Her expression wasn't desperate or demanding. It was simply tired, resigned, and that more than anything struck him deeply. "Where do you live?" he asked carefully, keeping his voice low. The girl looked down at her lap, then quietly told him an address. It was a part of the city he barely remembered existed, a neighborhood he hadn't driven through in years, one that wasn't on any of his development maps. Michael paused, then nodded once and started the car. He didn't know why he was doing this. There was no logic to it. He had no obligation to this girl, no reason to become involved in what was clearly someone else's responsibility. And yet, as he pulled out of the parking lot, glancing occasionally at her small form sitting silently beside him, he felt something unusual, an unfamiliar pressure building quietly in his chest. It wasn't discomfort. It wasn't pity. It was the beginning of something he couldn't name yet. Something that in time would change everything. The drive was quiet, filled only with the low hum of the engine and the occasional rustle of wind outside. Michael stole glances at the little girl as he navigated unfamiliar streets, watching her gaze fixed firmly on the world outside the window. She didn't fidget or speak. She sat with her back straight and her small hands folded over the straps of her backpack, the way someone might sit if they'd been taught not to take up space. It was the kind of silence that wasn't natural for a child. Too still, too practiced. It unsettled him. The address she'd given him led to the edge of a neighborhood long forgotten by city planners. Cracked sidewalks and boarded windows lined the streets. Telephone poles leaned slightly like they were tired and every few houses looked abandoned. He pulled up to a sagging 2-story home with chipped paint, its front steps uneven and the screen door hanging slightly ajar. He put the car in park and turned to her, expecting her to thank him and hop out. Instead, she looked up at him with those solemn brown eyes and said almost formally, "Would you mind coming in? My mom has trouble getting up." It was the first time her voice had carried any expectation, and yet it wasn't demanding. It was almost apologetic. Michael hesitated. Entering a stranger's home, especially one in a neighborhood like this, went against every instinct he had. But the girl was already opening the door, stepping out with quiet confidence. She didn't look back to see if he would follow. She just trusted that he would, and he did. The house was dark and too cold for the season. The air inside was thick with the scent of medicine and something faintly metallic, like old pennies. The walls were lined with old wallpaper curling at the edges, and the only light came from a small lamp in the living room, casting a soft glow over a sagging couch. On it lay a woman, mid-30s, maybe younger, but with the exhausted look of someone who'd lived twice as long. Her skin was pale, her cheeks sunken, and her frame buried beneath a faded blanket. When she saw them, she tried to sit up, but winced and leaned back against the cushions. "Emma," she croaked. Her voice was rough, strained. "Who?" The girl stepped forward. "He brought me home from school." "Mom, you couldn't come, remember?" Michael stood awkwardly near the doorway, unsure of what to say. The woman gave him a small nod, her expression flickering with embarrassment, gratitude, and pride all at once. "Thank you," she said weakly. I usually call the school, but today I couldn't get up. I didn't expect anyone to help." Michael nodded, his throat suddenly dry. "No trouble at all." Emma moved to her mother's side, adjusting the blanket with gentle hands. She didn't say much, but everything she did was done with careful intention, pulling the blanket higher, checking the bottle of pills on the side table, making sure her mother's water glass wasn't empty. Michael watched her with growing disbelief. This girl wasn't just mature, she was managing the household. At 6, he glanced around the room, noting the details. Now. No TV. A small heater humming in the corner. Half-full pill bottles lined up with labels. He didn't recognize a folding table in the kitchen piled with bills and a can of soup. He was used to problems that came with zeros and percentages. But this was a kind of quiet emergency that never made headlines. "Would you like some tea?" Emma asked, turning to him suddenly, as if hosting guests was part of her job. "No, thank you," he said softly. "You don't have to stay," the mother added, eyes fluttering closed for a moment. "But thank you again. You were kind." Michael should have left. Everything about this situation told him to go, to step back into his world of control and distance. But something in him resisted. Maybe it was the way Emma had spoken with such composure. Maybe it was the frailty in the woman's voice. Or maybe deep down he recognized something of himself in this broken place. A kind of loneliness he'd long since buried beneath boardrooms and skyscrapers. "What's your name?" he asked more gently than usual. "Sarah," the mother answered. "Sarah, I'm Michael Grayson." Her eyes opened slightly, flickering with faint recognition. "The builder?" "Yes." She gave a weak chuckle. "Didn't expect a billionaire to end up in my living room." Michael offered a small smile. "Neither did I." He stayed another 10 minutes. Not because there was much to say, but because it felt wrong to leave. Emma sat beside her mother, resting a hand on her arm, and Michael sat on the edge of a worn chair with springs that creaked under his weight. They didn't talk much more. But by the time he finally stood to leave, he felt something inside him shift. Not dramatically, not like a light switch, more like the slow, steady movement of something heavy turning toward a new direction. Outside, the sun had dipped lower and the sky had turned a pale orange. As he closed the door behind him, he looked back once, catching a final glimpse of Emma kneeling beside her mother, her head bowed in quiet watchfulness. He climbed into his car and sat for a long time, staring at the wheel, his hands resting in his lap. For the first time in years, he didn't know what the next move should be. But something told him he would be back. Not because it was convenient, but because it mattered. The next few days passed, but Michael couldn't shake the image of the little girl sitting quietly in his passenger seat or the sight of that dim, crumbling home where she had led him without hesitation. It followed him into meetings, into his quiet penthouse at night, into moments where he would usually be lost in forecasts or market trends. It was strange. He had spent years training himself to compartmentalize, to turn off emotion when it served no purpose, and to move on from things he couldn't fix. But this wasn't just a thing. It was a child, a mother, a life. He asked his assistant to quietly run a background check, not to invade privacy, but to understand what they were dealing with. The report came back the next day. Sarah Collins, 34 years old, single mother, no listed employment in the last 2 years, diagnosed with chronic respiratory failure and severe asthma with recent hospital visits logged but no consistent treatment plan. No insurance. No known relatives. One dependent, Emma Collins, age 6, enrolled at Leland Elementary. High attendance. Quiet. Teachers' notes consistently described her as polite, focused, and withdrawn. Michael felt the weight of it. He thought about how many children like her probably existed just miles from his office. He also thought about how easy it would be to ignore that knowledge. But he didn't. That same afternoon, he returned to the neighborhood. He brought groceries, just a few bags, nothing ostentatious, but enough to stock their small fridge with real food. He knocked, and when the door opened, Emma blinked at him, surprised, but not alarmed. "You came back," she said. "I said I'd help," he replied simply. Sarah was in better shape that day, sitting upright on the couch, her breathing slightly more steady. She looked at the bags in his hands and immediately tried to protest, but Michael only said, "Please, it's not charity. It's just help." That night, he arranged for a home care nurse to begin visiting 3 times a week. He didn't tell Sarah right away. He just gave the nurse the address, explained the situation, and said, "Tell her the school referred you." He also began picking Emma up from school regularly. At first, she waited hesitantly near the gate, as though unsure if he would truly come. But after the 3rd or 4th time, her routine changed. She began looking for his car. She no longer seemed surprised when he pulled up. They didn't talk much during the drives. Sometimes she would point out things she saw. Stray cats on fences, birds perched on street lamps, an old mural faded on a brick wall. Other times she would sit quietly and stare out the window, lost in thought. Michael let her take the lead. He didn't push, and gradually she began to open up. One day she asked, "What do you build?" He glanced at her in the rearview mirror. Mostly commercial towers, apartments, some hospitals. She nodded slowly as if filing that away. "You must be good at it. You look like someone who knows how to fix things." That made him pause, because the truth was he did know how to fix buildings, projects, contracts, even people's careers. But he'd never tried to fix a life. Not like this. That weekend, he returned to their house again, this time with a folding table and some new bedding. He set it up without ceremony. Sarah watched him from the couch, arms crossed weakly, but eyes thoughtful. "You don't owe us anything," she said after a while. Michael didn't answer right away. Then he looked at her and said, "I know. That's exactly why I'm doing it." She blinked, unsure what to make of that, but she didn't argue. Later that night, Emma sat on the small stoop outside while he finished adjusting the heater he brought over. It wasn't perfect, but it would warm the living room enough during the colder nights. She was watching the sky, legs swinging off the edge, and when he joined her, she said something he didn't expect. "Most people say they'll help. Then they disappear." He turned to look at her, taking in how calm her voice was. She wasn't bitter, just honest. "I'm not most people," he said. She looked at him for a long time, as if deciding whether she believed him. Then she nodded once slowly. "I know." And in that moment, something shifted again, not loudly, but firmly. As the sky faded into dark purple and the air grew colder, Michael realized he was no longer doing this out of guilt or even obligation. Somewhere between that first quiet ride and now it had become something deeper. He didn't just want to help Emma and her mother. He needed to. It was nearly a month since Michael first drove Emma home, and by now their unspoken rhythm had taken on the shape of a fragile new reality. Every afternoon, Michael would leave his glass-walled office, leaving behind multi-million-dollar proposals and high-stakes meetings to park his luxury car outside a modest elementary school, waiting among minivans and tired parents for one small girl in a yellow sweater and worn-out sneakers. She always walked to his car with a quiet calmness, never rushing, never expecting anything. But Michael noticed the way her eyes lit up ever so slightly the moment she spotted him waiting. She would slide into the passenger seat, fold her hands over her backpack, and offer him a tiny, grateful smile, and he had grown to look forward to that smile more than any boardroom win. At first, the staff at the school had stared. Some even whispered. A man of his stature, dressed in tailored suits and driving a 6F-figure vehicle, picking up a child from one of the poorest districts in the city. People noticed a teacher finally approached him one afternoon trying to keep her voice polite but firm and asked, "Are you family?" Michael had simply said no, but I'm who she has right now. And that was the end of the conversation. The visits to Emma's home became more regular. Michael no longer came with hesitation. He came with purpose. If groceries were low, he brought more. If Sarah's breathing seemed worse, he called in the nurse. If something in the house broke, he fixed it. And still, he kept a certain respectful distance. He didn't want to impose or make Sarah feel small. But she wasn't stupid. She saw what was happening. One evening, as he replaced a broken curtain rod in the living room, Sarah spoke from the couch with her usual soft voice, cracked from illness, but still sharp. "You know she's starting to think you're part of her life now," she said without looking at him. Michael paused, then carefully screwed in the final bracket before answering. "Maybe I am." Sarah gave a weak laugh. She's had people walk in and out her whole life. Her dad was gone before she turned 2. My sister vanished when I got sick. She doesn't get attached easily, but she's watching you. Michael sat on the edge of the coffee table, hands resting on his knees. He looked at Sarah. Really looked at her. She was a beautiful woman beneath the sickness with deep-set eyes and a quiet dignity that refused to beg. "I'm not going anywhere," he said finally. Her eyes welled up a little, but she blinked the tears away before they could fall. She needs more than someone who shows up. She needs someone who stays. The next morning, something unexpected happened. Michael had taken Emma with him to his office for a short while, needing to finish a few tasks before driving her home. He led her to the top floor of his downtown headquarters, where polished floors gleamed and the view stretched across the whole city. His staff gave her curious looks, but no one said a word. Emma, ever poised, stayed close to him, quietly, observing the space as if memorizing every detail. He let her sit in the corner of his office with a notepad and a book while he worked. At one point, his assistant entered to hand him documents and did a double take when she noticed Emma. "Mr. Grayson, should I?" "It's fine," he interrupted, not looking up. But Emma looked up. "I can wait outside if it's not allowed." Michael smiled and shook his head. "You're exactly where you should be." When the assistant left, Emma tilted her head. "Is this all yours?" He nodded. "I built it. Years of hard work." "Do you like it?" she asked, not out of curiosity, but as though she was measuring something deeper. Michael paused. "I thought I did." She nodded, satisfied with the honesty. Then she said, "It's very quiet up here. Like, it's all made to look important, but it's a little lonely." And just like that, this 6-year-old girl had said something no colleague or executive had ever dared admit aloud. That evening, Michael took a long detour on the way home. They passed through neighborhoods Emma had never seen, parts of the city filled with lights, storefronts, and music pouring out of speakers. She leaned her head on the window, watching everything in quiet wonder. At a red light, she asked softly, "Why do you help us?" Michael didn't answer immediately. Then, in a voice lower than usual, he said, "Because I can. And because I didn't know how much I needed to." The truth was, Emma had reminded him of something he thought he had long since buried. What it felt like to be small in a world that kept moving without you. He'd been that boy once, though with very different circumstances. A child who learned to be useful, silent, and self-sufficient far too early. The difference was he had no one who noticed, no one who asked why. But now he had noticed Emma, and he couldn't unsee her. That night, as he walked her to the apartment door, she turned to him and said, "You don't have to stay." "You know, I know," he said. "But I want to." She nodded, thoughtful, then added, "Most people say that." "You mean it?" He didn't reply. He just gently touched the top of her head, gave her a smile, and waited until the door closed before he walked away. The hallway lights flickered overhead, and the building groaned with age, but he felt a quiet certainty settle into his chest. He wasn't fixing a building anymore. He was rebuilding something far more fragile and far more important. By the time spring arrived, everything had changed in small, nearly invisible ways. Michael still ran a multi-million-dollar company, still arrived at his office each morning in a polished car with a perfectly pressed suit. But his days no longer belonged solely to numbers and meetings. His routine was now quietly tethered to a girl with brown eyes who waited outside her school each afternoon with a worn backpack and a quiet smile. Emma had become a part of his life without demanding it. The way light slips under a closed door. Gentle, uninvited, but impossible to ignore once you've noticed it. At home, Sarah's condition had improved slightly thanks to the nurse visits and medication Michael continued to arrange without drawing attention to himself. She was still fragile, still needed help for basic tasks, but her energy had returned enough to sit by the window in the mornings and listen to Emma talk about her day. Sometimes Michael joined them in the evenings, bringing small things, a book for Emma, soup for Sarah, sometimes just his presence. He didn't ask for anything in return, and they didn't offer gratitude in empty words. It wasn't a transaction. It was something slowly becoming deeper, more human, more permanent. One evening, while Emma was in the kitchen pouring cereal into mismatched bowls, Sarah motioned for Michael to sit beside her. Her voice was thin but steady. "She talks about you all the time. You know," she said, "she draws little pictures of your car, your office, your face. She's never done that before, not even why. Her teachers." Michael looked down, unsure how to respond. "I don't want to sound ungrateful," Sarah continued. "But I have to ask, what do you want from this? From her? From us?" It was a fair question. One she deserved to ask, one he had asked himself more than once. "I honestly don't know," he said. "At first, it felt like something I couldn't ignore. And now I just know I care what happens next, more than I thought I would." Sarah studied his face for a long time. There was no suspicion in her eyes, only concern for her daughter, for the unpredictable nature of the world. She had been failed by too many people to trust easily, but she was trying. He saw that in a way she let him return again and again without pushing him away. "I need you to promise me something," she said, her voice quieter now. "If something ever happens to me, don't let her fall through the cracks. She's stronger than she should be, but even strength has limits. Don't let her disappear." Michael didn't blink. "I won't," he said. Later that night, as he drove home, the city lights blurred through his windshield. He wasn't used to promises, not the kind that involved emotions instead of contracts. But this one settled into his bones with an undeniable weight. It wasn't obligation. It was something closer to instinct. A week later, a new file landed on his desk at the office. His assistant had prepared it at his request, a formal assessment of legal guardianship procedures in the state. He hadn't said why he wanted it. He wasn't even sure himself. But as he read through the requirements, he felt an uneasy mix of fear and certainty building in his chest. He wasn't a parent. He didn't know how to raise a child. But he had already done something more dangerous. He had let her into his heart. That weekend, Emma brought home a school assignment that involved drawing your family. Michael happened to be at the table helping her glue pieces of colored paper onto the page. She had drawn 3 stick figures. One was labeled me, the second was Mom, and the third was a tall figure in a suit with a dark head of hair. Michael asked quietly, "Who's this?" Without looking up, Emma said, "That's you." He swallowed. "You put me in your family." She looked at him like the question was strange. "You are?" Later that night, after Sarah had fallen asleep and Emma was brushing her teeth, Michael stepped outside onto the porch. The air was cooler now, spring fading into early summer, and he looked up at the sky the way he did when he was a boy, searching for something he couldn't name. He had built skyscrapers. He had reshaped city blocks. But this small life he had stumbled into was the most fragile, most complex thing he had ever tried to build. And maybe for the first time he was building it not because he had to, but because it meant something, because it mattered. Michael's world had always been driven by precision, strategy, and timing. He operated on calculated risk, made million-dollar decisions in moments, and kept every part of his personal life behind a wall so high no one had dared to scale it in years. But as summer rolled in, bringing longer days and warmer evenings, he began to feel like those walls were shifting, not crumbling, but changing shape, becoming something more like a doorway, something open. He still ran his company, still made decisions that impacted hundreds of employees and entire city blocks. But now, his days often ended not in his penthouse, but on a sagging porch with a mug of coffee cooling in his hands, while Emma told him stories about school, and Sarah dozed lightly by the window. It had become a second home, unspoken, but understood. He no longer knocked before entering. Emma no longer hesitated when asking him to stay longer. And Sarah, though still cautious, began to rely on him in quiet ways, asking him to read her medical reports, to pick up prescriptions, to sit with Emma when she was too exhausted to do more than sleep. But nothing about their situation was stable. Michael could see Sarah's strength fading again. Her breathing had worsened, and even though she smiled and insisted she was just tired, he recognized the signs. He'd watched strong people break before, but this was different. He couldn't afford to stand by. One Thursday, he left work early to meet with a specialist at the hospital, a favor he'd pulled through a connection. After reviewing Sarah's files, the doctor didn't sugarcoat anything. "She needs long-term care," the doctor said. "And soon, if she keeps trying to manage on her own, it's going to accelerate the decline." Michael sat there processing that. What does that mean for her daughter? The doctor gave him a long look. "Unless there's a plan, child services may step in." Those words echoed louder than anything else. Michael knew exactly what that meant. He had seen the system from a distance, read the reports, funded programs meant to fix it. But now it wasn't just a distant statistic. It was Emma. And he couldn't allow her to be swept into a process where she'd become just another file on someone's desk. That night, he went to the apartment as usual, but this time his energy was different. He didn't sit or drink tea or wait for Emma to fill the silence. He asked Sarah if they could talk alone, and she nodded slowly. Emma went to her room without question, as if she sensed what was coming. Michael sat across from Sarah and looked her straight in the eyes. "You need help more than I can give you from the sidelines. And Emma, she needs to know someone is going to be there." Sarah nodded slowly. "I've been thinking the same thing." She was quiet for a long moment before she spoke again. "I don't want to leave her behind, Michael, but I know I might not have a choice anymore. I know my body's giving out." Her voice cracked. "I'm terrified of what happens after." Michael leaned forward. "Then let me do something. Let me be that plan." She looked at him. "Really?" Looked at him. You mean guardianship? Yes. Legal official. I want to make sure she's protected, that she stays with someone who already loves her. Sarah swallowed hard. She didn't cry, though her eyes were glassy. She already sees you that way, you know. I see her that way, too. Sarah took his hand, frail and trembling. Then take care of her when I can't anymore. 2 days later, Michael began the paperwork. It wasn't simple. His legal team moved discreetly but thoroughly. He didn't want headlines. He wanted protection. Emma didn't know yet. He wanted to wait until things were more certain. But that weekend, something happened that made everything urgent. Sarah collapsed at home. Emma called Michael in a panic. He got there faster than the ambulance. She was rushed to the hospital, unresponsive, but breathing. The doctor stabilized her, but their faces were tight with concern. Michael stayed overnight in the waiting room. Emma curled beside him under his coat, clutching his arm like a lifeline. He didn't leave her side. He didn't answer calls. He wasn't CEO Michael Grayson that night. He was just a man holding on to a child who had already lost too much. In the quiet moments before dawn, as hospital machines beeped softly down the hallway, he looked down at Emma and whispered, "I promise I'll never let you go through this alone." She didn't respond. She was half asleep, eyes closed, breath even. But her hand tightened around his, and that was all he needed. The days that followed were the hardest Michael had ever known. Not because of financial pressure, not because of corporate instability, but because for the first time in his life, someone else's well-being had the power to unravel him. Sarah remained in the hospital, stabilized but weak, her breathing shallow, and her voice almost non-existent. The doctor spoke in vague terms, delicate, progressive, chronic management, but Michael heard what they weren't saying. There was no going back to the way things were. She wouldn't be coming home. Not soon. Maybe not ever. Emma visited every day and Michael never let her go alone. He adjusted his schedule around her, delegating meetings and pushing back board decisions without a second thought. She carried a small drawing pad to the hospital, sketching quietly in the corner of her mother's room while nurses moved quietly in and out. She never cried in front of Sarah, never complained, never demanded anything. But Michael saw it. The way her shoulders sat tighter, how she bit her lip when no one was looking, the way she clung just a little longer to his hand when they left the room. At home, things shifted quickly. Michael moved her into his place, not just for convenience, but for stability. Her bed from the apartment was brought over along with her books, her favorite worn-out stuffed animal, and the tiny yellow lamp shaped like a star. He gave her a room with windows that overlooked the city, not because it was big or beautiful, but because she liked to watch the lights before she fell asleep. He sat with her every night, now reading the same chapter books over and over, sometimes in silence, sometimes with her head resting against his side. His penthouse had never felt like a home until she brought her small, quiet world into it. Legal guardianship became official within 2 weeks. The court moved faster than expected, helped by letters from doctors, social workers, and even Sarah herself, who signed every page with trembling hands, but fierce clarity. In her final note to the judge, she wrote, "Michael Grayson has been more of a father to my daughter than anyone ever asked him to be. He did not come out of obligation. He came out of love. If I can't raise her, I trust that he will." When the paperwork was finalized, Michael held the stamped document in his hands and felt something like gravity shift inside him. It wasn't fear or regret. It was responsibility, a different kind than running a company. This one came with a heartbeat, a voice that laughed quietly in the mornings. A child who now looked at him like he was the safest place in the world. He told Emma the next evening, sitting beside her on the floor of her new room where she was coloring a drawing of a park. "Emma," he said gently, "the court made it official today. You're going to stay with me no matter what happens. You're safe now." She didn't answer immediately. Her pencil stopped moving, but she didn't look up. Then after a few seconds, she said softly, "Does that mean you're really my dad now?" He felt something catch in his chest. He could have said, yes. He could have said, legally, "I'm your guardian." But instead, he said, "I'm whatever you need me to be, and I'll be that for as long as you'll let me." She turned toward him and placed her hand on his arm. "I want you to be my dad." "You already are." He couldn't speak for a moment. He just nodded and pulled her close, wrapping his arms around her small frame as she leaned into him without hesitation. The hospital called 2 days later. Sarah's condition had worsened. They advised Michael to bring Emma in if possible. The two of them went together, quiet in the car, holding hands. When they arrived, Sarah smiled weakly as they entered the room. She looked thinner than ever, but her eyes still held that same warmth. "Hi, my love," she said to Emma, who climbed into the chair beside her and reached for her hand. Michael stayed in the background, letting them talk. Sarah asked about school, about the new room, about the books Emma was reading. She didn't mention anything sad. She didn't waste time saying goodbye. Later, when Emma stepped out with a nurse to get a snack, Sarah motioned for Michael to come closer. "Thank you," she whispered. "You don't have to." "I do," she said, firmer than before. "You gave her a future. You gave me peace. I don't have to worry anymore. She's loved. She's home." Michael blinked back something tight in his throat. "I'll take care of her every day. I swear." Sarah smiled. "I know you will." That night, Michael stood by Emma's door and watched her sleep. Her breathing was slow, steady, her small body curled beneath the soft blanket he had bought weeks ago on a whim, not realizing how much it would come to matter. He didn't sleep that night. He stood by the windows of his apartment, watching the city blink and move, and felt for the first time in his life like he was exactly where he was meant to be. Not above it all, but inside something real, something good, something that asked not for perfection, but for presence. And he was there. Summer gave way to autumn, and with it came a quiet rhythm that settled into every corner of Michael's once sterile life. The mornings began earlier now, with the sound of Emma brushing her teeth down the hall, the clinking of cereal bowls in the kitchen, and the occasional shuffle of tiny footsteps running late. Michael no longer lingered in bed or rushed into work with blind efficiency. He made time to walk Emma to school, not because it was necessary, but because it had become one of his favorite parts of the day. They talked about everything and nothing. Her math test, the funny thing a classmate said, what colors the trees were turning. These walks grounded him more than any shareholder meeting ever had. Sarah passed away in early October. It was a quiet Sunday morning, the air just beginning to cool, and Michael had taken Emma to the park while the hospital staff called. They had known it was coming. Still, nothing prepares you for the absence of someone who anchored a piece of your life. When they arrived at the hospital, Sarah was already gone. Her face was peaceful, like she had simply fallen asleep. Emma didn't cry right away. She sat on the edge of the hospital bed, holding her mother's hand one last time, whispering things only they could understand. Michael gave her that space, standing silently by the door, his hands in his pockets, feeling both helpless and honored to be there. The funeral was small, just a few nurses, a teacher from Emma's school, and one neighbor who remembered Sarah from before her illness. Michael handled all the arrangements. He made sure everything was as dignified and graceful as Sarah had been in her final days. Emma stood beside him during the service, clutching a single yellow rose and refusing to let go of his hand. Afterward, they went home, not to the apartment Sarah had once called hers, but to the place Emma now simply called home. That night, she crawled into Michael's bed without saying anything. He didn't ask questions. He just held her as she cried until she fell asleep. The months that followed were filled with small necessary adjustments. Michael enrolled Emma in a new school closer to the apartment, one with a better library and teachers who weren't overwhelmed. He hired a tutor, not to push her, but to help her rebuild her confidence. He attended every school meeting, every open house, every small play where Emma stood shyly on stage in paper costumes. His staff adjusted, too. His meetings were rescheduled to allow for pickups. His assistant kept a drawer stocked with snacks and children's books. The cold corporate air of his office had softened, not with decorations, but with a change in tone, less urgency, more purpose. Emma changed in subtle ways. Her eyes were still serious, still old for her age, but now they sparkled when she laughed, and she laughed more often. She left drawings on his desk, sticky notes on the fridge with reminders for him to eat, and occasionally when he was on long calls, she would slip into his office and sit quietly just to be near him. She still asked about her mother sometimes, usually at night. Michael never avoided the topic. They spoke openly, honestly, not as two people broken by loss, but as two people learning how to carry it together. One evening, just before Christmas, they were decorating a small tree Michael had never owned before. Emma placed ornaments carefully, standing on her tiptoes, pausing to admire each one. She had picked out every piece from a tiny local shop, insisting they needed something real, not something perfect. As she hung a little golden star at the top, she turned to him and asked, "Do you think she sees us right now?" Michael nodded. "I think she sees everything and I think she's proud." Emma smiled. "Me, too." Later that night, while cleaning up glitter and tinsel, Emma handed him a small box. Inside was a keychain with the word Dad engraved on one side and always on the other. "I saw it in a shop and saved for it," she said quickly, almost nervously. "I know it's not a real present," but Michael didn't let her finish. He bent down, pulled her into his arms, and held her tighter than he ever had before. "It's the best gift I've ever received," he whispered. And he meant it. That night, as the lights on the tree blinked quietly in the background and the city stretched out beyond the windows, Michael sat on the couch with Emma beside him, her head on his shoulder and her breathing soft and steady. He realized something he hadn't fully understood until now. This wasn't a temporary arrangement. This wasn't rescue or redemption. This was family, not born, but chosen, built one moment at a time out of grief, kindness, and the quiet bravery of showing up. He wasn't the man he used to be, and he didn't want to be. He was a father now, and that was the most important title he'd ever earn. To me, the ending of this story isn't just heartwarming. It's quietly powerful in a way that lingers. It's not about grand gestures or dramatic revelations. It's about two people broken in different ways choosing each other. Michael, a man who built towers but lived in emotional isolation, finds meaning not in his empire but in the quiet responsibility of fatherhood. Emma, a child who learned to survive in silence, finally learns what it means to feel safe, seen, and deeply loved. What makes this story so special is its realism wrapped in hope. It doesn't pretend that love erases pain or that success can buy happiness. Instead, it shows how healing comes slowly in ordinary moments, in bedtime routines, in after-school walks, in shared grief, in small, steady acts of showing up. That's the kind of transformation that feels real, earned. The best part is that neither Michael nor Emma set out to save the other. But by simply not walking away, by daring to care without conditions, they both found something they didn't even know they needed. Family, not one made by blood, but by choice. And that's what gives this story its weight and its quiet beauty.